Crazy. Chris Anderson,
So
we're on the air.
Rick, I don't see you. I see me. So I'm assuming something's about to happen, but we are live.
We
So
are
welcome
live.
Everybody.
I'm going to jump off.
Joining us. I'm
going to restart, and you can chat to people and talk for a minute. I'll restart and come right back. Okay. You can't hear me. This is awesome. Okay. I'm going to jump out. I'll come back in a moment. Okay. Hey, everybody. We're having a little bit of a technical problem. We're just trying to work our way through it here. So give us a moment. Saul, hang in there, and we'll be back with you. Chris, can you hear me at all?
I can hear you. Yeah. You want me to restart?
No. I'm going to restart. You stay there. Okay.
Oh. I guess this is where I just start singing. Oh, Susan, don't worry. You'll hear singing soon. I hope. Oh. Thank you, Liz. Well, we're just waiting for Rick to come back in. And if he doesn't soon, well, then we'll just start without him. But it's good to see everybody. George, do I still look frozen? And Ken, glad you're back joining us. Liz, I'm glad you can see and hear me. Yeah, so we have an audience. I just don't have a co-host yet. So we have to start sending Rick some nasty grams here. Yeah.
Hey.
Hey.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Can you see me?
I can see you.
Wow. And so what have you been doing when I've been not here?
What do you mean? What have I been doing? I've been talking to all the people that have showed up and I've been saying, hey,
nice.
They said they can see and hear me. Where's Rick? And I said, well, I don't know.
You guys let me know. Did Chris do okay? I mean, I want to know. I don't know. I have to go back and watch. I want to make sure that Chris was hanging in there.
And what would you do? What would you do? Fire me?
We were just talking about Saul was talking about having added a third person to his podcast. We could add who's a third person? Maybe the people in the audience can suggest a third person to us. So hi everybody, and welcome to History Happy Hour. And thanks to Stephen Ambrose Tours for bringing you History Happy Hour. And you can check out their rich offering of military history tours at StephenAmbroseTours.com. And whether you're watching live, watching on replay, or listening on the HHH
podcast.
Yeah, we're glad you're here. Today we're going to be talking about World War II in North Africa. And so I'm still trying to, I have just restarted my computer, Chris. I'm trying to find my show notes. Oh, there they are.
There you are.
So you guys should let us know what you're drinking, because we're definitely drinking. I'm still finishing up my tea because of my cold, but I do have a beer here as well.
One would hope.
Yeah. And Chris, we should thank everybody who supports us via Patreon. We just got a Patreon. We get the Patreon payments once a month. So we got one this month. And so I would just say thank you to all those folks. And you can join our Top Shelf patrons, or just, you can pledge $5 a month if you want at patreon.com/historyhappyhour. Oh, okay. Losing my voice.
All right. So you got you back on. Now you're gonna lose your voice.
So you better tell me who's watching. So
yeah, well, I haven't. I've said, and Lynn is, and Susan Skelly's with us. Douglas McCord is here. Yeah, Wally, Liz. We got a bunch of people here.
Excellent.
We're gonna get going. Yeah.
Thank you. So let's get going. Yeah, give me a cue, and I'll try to find the open here.
The bar is open.
The bar is open. Chris, what's on tap today?
Yeah, well, I'm excited to have an HHH alumni, Saul David, back to join us. Saul is a historian, broadcaster, and author of numerous books of fiction and nonfiction. And by numerous, I mean it takes up like the whole title page of the book. His books have been shortlisted for the Westminster Medal for Military History and variously named at Waterhouse Military History Book of the Year and an Amazon History Book of the Year. He is the co-host of the Battleground podcast, which is very good, by the way, with History Happy Hour alum Patrick Bishop. But most important of all, he is, of course, an alumni of History Happy Hour. We've had him on several times before, but we're here to talk about his new book, Tunisgrad. Oh, yeah.
Oh, you weren't trusting that I could pull it out.
It's back up, baby. It's back up.
You just, things are going wrong. So this is more chaos than even you're probably used to.
Well, Battleground is a well-oiled machine, so this is.
It's very nice to see that not every organization works, as well as it seems from the outside. But yeah, listen, you cope with what was looking a bit tricky with 30 seconds to go very well. So well done, you two.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much.
But to get started, so it's not going so well for the Germans, and you start the book with Lieutenant General Walter Warlott, who is in Hitler's headquarters. He's Yodel's number 3, and he says that November of 1942 was the month of doom in modern German history. What is he driving at there, and why did you start the book there?
Yeah, I mean, I started with the story of Hitler getting the news that he's on his train, by the way, his special train. He's heading from Berlin to Munich, and he gets the news in the middle of the night. This is the 8th of November, 1942. That the Western Allies, in fact, they described them as the Americans, which was half right, was the Americans and the Brits, were landing in French North Africa. Now, that was on the 8th. 4 days earlier, Rommel and his Panzer Army had lost the Battle of Alamein. That was the kind of 8-day meat grinder, and he'd lost the Battle of Alamein and was beginning to withdraw out of Egypt. So that was the second moment that was bad news for the Germans in November 1943. And the third one, of course, came at the end of the month, which was the Russian counterattack, or the Soviet counterattack, to be more specific, at Stalingrad. And of course, we all know how that turned out. So I think, to be fair, Warlimont is slightly with the benefit of hindsight, but nevertheless, these 3 key moments happened in that month, and it wasn't good news for the Germans.
So you call your book Tunisgrad. Now, is that from a quote? What's that from? What does it mean?
Yeah, well, I found that title in Rick Atkinson's book, Army at Dawn, wonderful book about the first of his trilogy, in which he starts off in North Africa, then goes to Italy, of course, with Volume 2, and then finally Northwest Europe for Volume 3.
Volume 1 is the good one. So
the Volume 1 is the good one, exactly. The Army at Dawn, I think it was called. And I was wondering when I saw that quote, it's absolutely perfect. I've just described, of course, that November was also the month at which the beginning of the end in Stalingrad. So was this really a term the Germans used, or is Rick Atkinson using it slightly ironically? Did a little bit of research, and lo and behold, it was a term the German public were using for the disaster in North Africa, which, of course, played out, as no doubt we'll discuss, 2 or 3 months after Stalingrad. But it was very much an oh my goodness, not again. Really, you're seriously telling me that this disaster is happening in North Africa? Well, it's, we're going to call it with a little bit of tongue in cheek, but also a kind of sense of looming disaster, Tunisgrad.
So, but again, then why, given that, there are plenty of books written about Stalingrad, there are plenty of books written about Guadalcanal, why is this, I know you mentioned it in the book, and I think it's true that, for at least to American readers, Tunisia is kind of like, eh.
Yeah, well, there's a very good reason, Chris, and that's because the senior American commanders, when they came over to the UK in early 1942, said, we've got a strategy, which is to deal with Germany first. That had been agreed with the British a year earlier. So everybody knew what they wanted to do. The question is, how are they going to do it? How are they going to defeat Germany? The Joint Chiefs of Staff, when they came over, particularly US Army Chief of Staff Marshall, were very much of the opinion, let's get into Northwest Europe as quickly as possible. If we can't get in any huge numbers in 1942, let's at least make a show of force. Operation Sledgehammer, as it was planned, they're going to land somewhere like Brittany, or at least somewhere in Northwest Europe. The British counter argument was, this is going to be a disaster. It's too early. The Germans are still too strong. We need to find somewhere else where we can go in together, learn the business. That is, you can learn the business, the American troops who were fresh to European fighting. You can learn the business of fighting the Germans, but not against, overwhelming German force of the type you would almost certainly have met in France in 1942. Let's go to North Africa. We can do some serious damage to the Axis war effort, not least because this is where Italy, this is where Mussolini's imperial interests and imperial ambitions are. He wants to create a kind of new Roman Empire in North Africa. And if we can totally defeat the Axis forces in North Africa, we can probably knock the Italians out of the war. We can certainly regain control of the shipping lanes in the Mediterranean. And then ultimately, that's going to open up the whole of Southern Europe to invasion. And this is probably the best thing we can do towards the end of 1942. Certainly, if we go into Northwest Europe, as I say, it's going to be a disaster. Now, the US Chiefs of Staff weren't convinced. The British Chiefs of Staff were very firmly of that opinion. Churchill was also agreeing with the English-British argument. Yeah. Fortunately I think for the Western Allies, I don't think it's unfair to say this, Roosevelt also got the British argument. It was the only time in the Second World War didn't take the advice of his senior military commanders. And I think ultimately, even with the benefit of hindsight, guys, it was the right decision.
Okay. So this Allied landing is called Operation Torch, and I have a nice map of it that you've supplied for us. Can you give us an overview of Operation Torch? And I know he's off the map, but if you can tell us where General Rommel is, what he's doing when this battle starts.
Yeah, and it's important to get a sense of where Rommel is, because the whole idea for the plan of Operation Torch is to land enough Western allies, that's British and Americans, and hopefully get a few French on board. And I'm sure we'll come to them in a minute because it's a very complicated story, but enough British and Americans on board in Western North Africa to eventually be able to, and the maps come up now. So you can see French Morocco to the left of the map and French Algeria in the center, and then furthest to the right of the map is Tunisia. This is obviously going to be the key battleground. Why? Because Tunisia lies between those two countries we've already mentioned and Libya, and that's the country into which Rommel. So if you go off towards the right, the lower right of the map, you'll go all the way through Libya to Egypt. That is the location for the defeat of Rommel at the Battle of El Alamein, and he's going to be coming gradually, retreating gradually all the way through Libya into southern Tunisia, which is where, in the end, you're going to get the Montgomery's 8th Army coming from Egypt, and you're going to get these forces, Operation Torch forces, that have just landed in French North Africa, going to be trying to squeeze Rommel's army between the two of them. And this would have been a relatively straightforward operation if Hitler, I mentioned the fact that Hitler got this information on the morning of the 8th of November 1942, hadn't doubled down at this point. Almost immediately, the scales have fallen from his eyes, and he's thinking, we've got to do something about this. There's a chance that Mussolini is going to be knocked out of the war. We've got to get as many forces into Tunisia as quickly as possible. Why Tunisia? Because that's closest to Libya, so he can retain contact with Rommel's forces, but also because it's closest to Sicily and Italy. So if you look at the map and you look at the north of Tunisia on the map, and that's to the lower right of the map, you will see directly to its right Sicily, and of course the peninsula of Italy just below, above that. And that meant, of course, guys, that they were able to get air cover into Tunisia relatively easily. And it's why the early stage of the fighting, as I'm sure we're going to come on to discuss in a minute, effectively goes the German way, because they have the benefit of being able to get a lot of troops into Tunisia, but they've got air power too, and air power plays a really key part in the whole of the campaign.
So what sort of forces are we committing to this, and how ready are we for this?
Yeah, it was a good question. I mean, the logistical operation for Torch is astonishing. I mean, we obviously know about D-Day, and we'll know about some of the big amphibious operations that are going to take place in the Mediterranean thereafter. But I would compare Torch much more to Okinawa, subject of one of my previous books, in terms of the massive lines of supply. So a lot of the supplies and the troops were either coming from the USA, which is 3,000 miles away, or they're coming from the UK, which is about 1,000 miles away. I mean, these are hugely long supply lines. And that's one of the reasons why, if listeners can remember the map that we've just shown, it's why they actually decide to go. Yeah, so we've got the map up again. It's why, if you see those three prongs, those are the three landing points. They don't come any further east on the map, any further to the right of the map, than Algiers, for the simple reason that they know that the Germans, the Axis, that is the Germans and the Italians, have a lot of sea power and air power when you get close to Sicily and Tunisia. So if we land in those locations, that's going to enable us to get enough force on shore. How many troops are we talking about? 50,000 are going to be landed in the initial operation, which is not that many. But the Germans don't have any in Tunisia at this point. It's still effectively controlled by Vichy France. So it's really a race for, can we get our forces from Algiers, which is about 400 miles west of Tunis? Can we move those forces quickly enough to stop the Germans coming in? And ultimately, the Western Allies are going to lose the race for Tunis, as it was known, because the Germans are able to bring in people by sea, also by air, and set up a series of blocking positions, which prevents the Western Allies from gaining these crucial ports and gateway to Tunisia, which are the ports of Tunis, the capital, and Bizerta to the north.
So you talk about the landings in the various places, and you don't say a great deal about this, but I do just want to mention, just to prove that I have read your book, that in the footnote on page 74.
Oh, wow.
You mentioned that your grandfather, your mother's father, I believe, Lieutenant Commander Aubrey David, was part of the invasion force. So what was his job? And then, of course, did you ever get to talk to him about it, or had he passed away before you were on the scene, or what's the story there?
Yeah, it's amazing, actually, that I knew of a lot of his war service from my father. My father was a national serviceman, effectively conscripted during the 1950s in the Royal Navy, but his father was a regular, so he was a professional seaman. And by the time of the Second World War, I knew various stories about my grandfather, that he'd been an officer and an armed merchantman during the convoys across the Atlantic, and that had been sunk, and he'd narrowly survived that. And, a lot of dramatic stories. He was also in the submarine service in the 1930s, and apparently his wife, my grandmother, said, no, you're spending far too long away from the family. She had 7 children. My father was number 6 of those 7 children. You need to spend more time at home. But what I didn't realize until I was researching the book is, I was talking to my dad, this is a couple of years ago. He sadly passed away earlier this year, but not before he was able to tell me, I remember your grandfather going up to Ardmurchan in Scotland, Achnacarry, in Scotland, and doing commando training. I was like, really? I thought he's in the Navy. Why the Navy doing commando training. Well, they used to set up something called a beach commando, which I knew nothing about until I was researching this book, believe it or not. And I've written books about special operations in the Second World War before, including SBS. So you would have thought I might have come across the beach commandos. I hadn't. Anyway, you volunteer for it. You go and have proper commando training. And the job basically is to go in with the assault troops and secure the beach, get rid of any dangerous ordnance, obviously operate as, you know, as security in terms of making sure there's no counterattack on the beach. But the third job is to make sure the beach is secure enough so that all the follow-up troops and the supplies can come in. And the guy in charge of the commando generally takes over as beach master, and that was my grandfather. So he not only did he command the beach commando, and there's a wonderful picture which sadly isn't in the book because for various technical reasons we couldn't use it, but there's a picture of him sitting on a beach at Oran in North Africa with a little hut behind him. I mean, literally just like a really basic structure with BM on the side of it, and that's beach master. So that was his role. He actually played a part in the crucial landings, and I never knew this until I researched the book.
Okay. Well, so I mean, I know it's an incredibly complex topic, and as so often happens with our show, we're only going to touch on a few things in the book. But when the landings happen, they are fearful or unsure of what's going to happen with the French, the Vichy French. So, you know, tell us a little bit about where they fit into the story, you know, and I'm particularly interested in what's happening at Iran, which you just mentioned, because it's not so easy there.
No, well, the big question is, what are the French going to do? Now, just to give a bit of context to everyone listening and watching this, is that the French, of course, have been our allies in 1939 and 1940. And there's a lot of bad feeling at the way that campaign, that is the Dunkirk campaign, ends. The Germans blame us for doing a runner, as they were, sorry, the French blame doing a runner at Dunkirk. We, on the other hand, say, well, the French have fought so poorly, we've got to get out what troops we can. And probably we would have not had an opportunity to fight on if we hadn't gone out of Dunkirk. What happens a few weeks later after Dunkirk really gives you a kind of sense of understanding why there's still a lot of bitterness in North Africa. Churchill very sensibly says, well, the second most powerful navy in Europe is the French. There's a danger the Germans are going to get their hands on it. So we need to either sink the French fleet or force them to hand it over to us. And one of these confrontations takes place at a location, an anchorage called Mers El Kabir, which is next to Oran, which you mentioned, Chris. And we basically give the French admiral an ultimatum. He rejects it, and we sink what's left of their fleet. One or two ships get away, but we kill about 1,500 French sailors and as I say, sink a number of ships. And there's a lot of bad feeling as a result of that. Nevertheless, if you fast forward a couple of years on, you've now got Vichy France really under the foot of the Germans. I mean, it's technically neutral, but it's really controlled by Germany in terms of its foreign policy. And we are hoping, that is the Western allies, the Americans and the British are hoping, when we land on French North Africa, enough people in the Vichy armies in North Africa are going to see sense. They're going to get a sense of which way the wind's blowing, and they're going to come over to our side. But what actually happens is for 2 days, from the 8th and the 9th until part of the 10th, so for 48 hours, the French do fight pretty stoically, and particularly at Oran, where there's an attempt to capture the port intact. There's a bit of a bloodbath. They send in these 2 ships in an attempt to capture the port by coup de main, and it doesn't go well. And a lot of Americans, actually, they are the main combat that Iran, lose their lives. One other little wrinkle about the story of the landing at Torch is that because the British are so unpopular with the French as a result of the stories I've just told you, particularly Mers El Kabir, all the British servicemen are wearing stars and stripes on their shoulders. So the and they're also wearing American uniforms. So the idea is to make the French believe that this is the Americans who they don't have a particular beef with in comparison. But also just, you know, to give people a sense of this is a neutral country being invaded by, you know, forces with weapons. So there was always a likelihood that the French are not going to be happy about that. Obviously, they weren't told about it in advance. And as I say, they fight for 48 hours. And those 48 hours are crucial because it stops our chart. It slows up the possibility that we can get to those 2 crucial ports in Tunisia, as I mentioned, as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, the Germans, of course, are pouring their troops, and the Italians are pouring their troops into Tunisia and that's why they win the race for Tunis.
So I just want to insert though that action at Oran that doesn't go so well. There's a Canadian-born Royal Naval officer that takes part in that, right?
Yeah, that's right. Well,
Parker.
actually, yeah, that's absolutely right. And he wins the VC, and it's a really sad story. So Canadians could win the Victoria Cross. I think most people watching this are going to know that in the Second World War. And it's in many ways, it's a deserved medal. I think the plan was a bit optimistic, to be truthful. They're going to use these 2 ships and some special forces commandos in canoes to basically get into the harbor, take over the warships in there, and ultimately capture the harbor intact, as I said. And the man in charge of this, was, remind me of the name you just mentioned.
Parker, wasn't it? Was it Parker?
Not Parker. It's something else. I think Parker might have been in command of one of the American battalions there.
Okay. Yeah, sorry.
But anyway, he slips my mind. But he's a naval officer. He's decorated from the First World War, Canadian naval officer, and it's his plan, and he's convinced everyone it can work. It goes horribly wrong. He's captured, later released, of course, because the French, whoever they take prisoner at this point, once they realize the game's up, when the Western Allies have got enough people into French North Africa, everyone's released again. He does do extraordinarily well. A lot of people on his ship are killed. Have you managed to track down his name?
Yeah, Frederick Thornton Peters.
Peters, that's right. Yeah,
I know
Peters.
it was a P. There we go.
Yeah, wonderful character. And the real tragedy of the story is that after trying to carry out this action, which doesn't go well, as you say, he nevertheless is recommended for, and ultimately is going to be awarded a Victoria Cross. But traveling back to the UK, his plane crashes. I mean, what bad luck is that? And he's getting very close to the southern coast of the UK. His plane crashes and he dies, and he's awarded a posthumous VC for his family, but of course never.
Wow. So the Germans are pouring troops in, and eventually North Africa is where Americans first go into combat against Germans, and vice versa, at least against the soldiers of Nazi Germany. We did fight some Germans 20 years before. So who comes off best in their first clash of arms, and does that change during the 7 months of fighting? And if so, why? That's a 3-part question.
Do you know what?
Oh, you stuck that in there.
But it's a brilliant question. And do you know what? And all the times I've been talking about this book, Rick, honestly, no one's phrased it like that. And the reason it's such a good question, whether it was intentional or not, actually the very, very first bit of combat between American armor and German armor, and I know people are going to be thinking, well, I bet that went horribly wrong, didn't it? It didn't. It was amazingly successful. So there's a battle during the early stage. So this is late November, when the American and British forces are trying to get to Tunis, and the Germans and the Italians are setting up blocking positions. There's an armored battle in which literally, this is very unusual, both armored forces are moving to contact. That's a little bit later, by the way, the picture you've shown there, but that'll give people a sense. So in the foreground, just to give people a sense of what they're looking at, that is an 88 millimeter anti-aircraft gun that was often used for anti-tank work. And in the background, I think that's a Churchill tank, but that picture was taken in about April 1943. So if we go back to the beginning of the campaign, to November 1942, you've got this two forces meeting up. And what's extraordinary about this battle is that Patton says, just literally 3 or 4 weeks later, our armors, we're undergunned, we're under, we don't have a good enough equipment to really take on the Germans. This is before the Shermans came in any force to the campaign. And at the beginning, they didn't have such good tanks. They didn't have the M4, as it was known. They had M3s and M2s, which are much lighter tanks. Stuarts, and I can't remember the name of the other one, but in any case,
the Grant tank.
Exactly, the Grant. And in this early action, there's an attack by German Mark IV, so not the Tigers, which they do have in North Africa, but they come in later on. There's an attack by Mark IVs, which is still a formidable bit of kit with a 75 millimeter gun. And amazingly, well, fortunately, there is a company of American tanks that are in a hull down position on the flank, and as the Mark IVs are going past them, they're just shooting. They don't have very big guns. I think it's a 50 millimeter, possibly even a 37 millimeter, but quick firing guns, and they're just riddling the side and rear of these tanks. And actually, they knock out 7 or 8 Mark IVs and completely blunt the German armored attack, and they withdraw. Having said that, the reason the question is a good one is because that is the first armor on armor action which goes the American way. But thereafter, it's downhill, I'm afraid, at least for the first couple of months of the campaign. There are a lot of armors lost by the Americans. The Germans really get their act together. That was an unusual fight for them. What they're very good at, the Germans, is bringing you onto their armor. So they can fight aggressively, but they're also very good at using their anti-tank guns. We saw that picture before. So basically, they wait for you to attack. They knock you out with anti-tank guns, and then they use their tanks for maneuver and mopping up anyone who's left. And that's pretty much what they do. They take a lot of or destroy a lot of American armor as I say, in those first 2 or 3 months, particularly at Kasserine Pass. I don't know how much you want to get into the detail of Kasserine Pass, but it is fascinating because on the one hand, you think, well, the Western Allies are bound to win ultimately, but Kasserine Pass and the strategy that the preamble, the thinking, the operational thinking that goes into that battle is, I think, a real hinge moment in the campaign. It's an opportunity for the Germans and the Italians to pull the chestnuts out of the fire.
Yeah, and I want to kind of, I guess, lead up, maybe back up a bit, but you say that they land, they beat the French, they begin advancing across North Africa, French Morocco, et cetera, but they don't win the race.
Yeah. Right.
So there are some battles that I know, speaking to British friends that I have here, they're aware of that most Americans have never heard of. So maybe I got to think of like Longstop Hill, for example. Mm-hmm. Maybe you could just highlight briefly a few of the actions, what they're like, why we're surprised, why we're defeated, why are the Germans able to stop us?
There's one particular battle called the Battle of Taberba, which takes place from the 1st to the 4th of December. Taberba is a town. If you look at, we're going back to the map. I'm not sure it's actually on the map, but the map of Tunisia. If we can, I don't know if you've got a map of Tunisia there, somewhere northern Tunisia. Maybe
no, that's the south, but not north.
Okay, well, anyway, if we look at that map, and you can see Tunis and Bizerta on the map you've just shown there, if you go a little bit to the left of Tunis, you will get to the Taberba, which I'm talking about, which is only 25 miles away from Tunis. So you're very close to where they're trying to get to. But it's at this particular location that the Germans really prove their worth. So what they bring in are a lot of veteran troops. They're bringing in panzer divisions, but they're also bringing in paratroopers. And the early troops, they've only got about 15,000 troops during the so-called race for Tunis. We've got a lot more troops, but we're not, it takes time for us to get them there. So maybe, no one's done the exact numbers, but maybe it's about 15,000 versus 15,000. But the Germans have two big advantages. One, their troops are very experienced, and they're in effectively defensive positions at first, although the Battle of Taberba is actually an aggressive battle that they fight. But they also, and I mentioned this before, guys, they have the benefit of air power. Why? Because they've got all the airfields in Tunisia, the hard standing airfields in Tunisia, that they're literally able to bring their planes over from Sicily, line them up there, and then they can operate out of those airfields. The Western Allies, on the other hand, are coming all the way from Algeria, and they have no airfield. So they're flying all the way from Algiers. That's 400 miles each way, and they can only stay over the battlefield for literally just a few minutes. And as a result, the Germans have air superiority during most of these early battles. Also, the weather's getting worse. We're in late November. It's raining. And the conditions in terms of terrain, which I probably should have mentioned before, Tunisia, generally speaking, is very mountainous. In the north, there's a certain amount of coastal plain, but you also got these pimples everywhere, these smallish mountains. I mean, you mentioned Longstop Hill, one of the famous battles takes place there. You've got a lot of mountains that are about 600 feet high, 700 feet high, and that's enough, hills, I should say. But that's enough if you control them to stop any movement of wheel traffic and tanks through the passes, as long as you can hold on to those positions. The Battle of Taburba, just to go back to that for a second, was really an opportunity for the Germans to create more breathing room, as they would have called it. They want to push us back far enough so that they can create a defensive position that will eventually allow Rommel to, you know, link up with the forces that they bring into Tunisia. Then they're going to think, okay, once we've got properly linked up and once we've got our forces all aligned together, particularly our panzers, then maybe we can go on the attack, which of course is going to happen in 1943, as I've already kind of suggested in the Kasserine battle.
Yeah.
Well, probably Kasserine is the for a lot of Americans, if they've heard of any battle in North Africa, that may be the only one. And it's a substantial American defeat. And after Kasserine, Eisenhower's chief of staff, Beadle Smith, writes, "The outstanding fact to me is that the proud and cocky Americans today stand humiliated by one of the greatest defeats in our history. Fortunately, this is being followed by a determination to profit from our mistakes and to get in there and beat the hell out of the Axis." So briefly, I know it's hard. What happens at Kasserine Pass? Whose fault is it? We have to find someone to blame. And how did the Americans profit from our mistakes?
Well, Kasserine Pass was a battle that was really the last throw of the dice by Rommel. Actually, if you take the proper term, the Battle of Kasserine, it's not just the fight for the Kasserine Pass. It's also a couple of other actions that take place prior to that. So we've got the map here. If you look right in the center of the map, you might be able to see a location called Sidi Bouzid. And this is not often remembered. Actually, just one quick thing to orientate people looking at that map. The Western Allied forces, including the French, by the way, who were actually fighting on our side by this point, were strung out on two mountain ranges, the eastern and the western dorsals, which you can just about see. I think you can see the mark, that flagged up on the map. The Germans realized, Rommel and the other commander, von Arnim in Tunisia, realized, if we can break through both of these mountain ranges, both of these passes through these two mountain ranges and get into the rear of what is the First Army, that's the British First Army, the Americans are attached to it, the Second American Corps is attached to it. Maybe we can get all the way up to the north, it will be another Dunkirk, we can completely cut off their supply lines and utterly defeat the First Army before the Eighth Army, Montgomery's army, actually is able to enter the fray. And Montgomery's army is coming from the south of this map as we look at it. And what happens at Kasserine is that, first of all, the battle at Sidi Bouzid is fought, and that's a tremendous success for the Axis forces. They launch a kind of pincer attack on American positions in Sidi Bouzid. They come out of a pass, the Faid Pass, which you can see to the right of the picture, and then they move to Sidi Bouzid, where the American positions are strung out. So you ask about responsibility. Well, ultimately, the responsibility lies with the American commander, General Fredendall, who hasn't gone down in history as a great military commander, with a certain amount of good reason. And I thought, well, maybe history's been a little bit harsh on him. So I was looking into the sequence of events. Well, he digs himself an air raid shelter, which, as a corps commander, effectively his command post is underground. He burrows his way into the hillside. And when Eisenhower comes to visit him a couple of days before the events of which we're talking, he says, what the hell's going on here? I've never seen a corps commander build himself an underground shelter. This is not a good sign. But he doesn't sack Fredendall. Fredendall's too far away from the scene of the action. But to be fair to him, there were other people responsible for this defeat. First of all, just circumstances. His forces were too strung out. He was expected to hold far too long a defensive line, and the Germans had seen the vulnerability of this. The other man responsible was General Anderson, who's the army commander, so that's Fredendall's immediate superior. He's a British general who thinks that they've got a certain amount of intelligence that the Axis are about to attack, but he thinks the attack's going to be much further north. So he's moved some of his troops up to the north, and that has left Fredendall's forces particularly the 1st Armored Division and the 1st Infantry Division, the famous Big Red One, who are defending in the Sidi Bouzid area, much more exposed than they needed to be, with much less support than they should have had. And the German attack is ultimately successful. It utterly defeats an armored force there. It leaves a lot of infantry isolated on these hilltops. There's an attempt to rescue them the following day. That's utterly defeated. And in a very short period of time, about 2,000 Americans in and around the location of Sidi Bouzid, which is somewhere in the center of that map, are taken. Now, it's at this point that Rommel comes into the fray, because that operation has really been under the aegis of von Arnim, who's commanding the 5th Panzer Army. Rommel is now commanding his own Panzer Army. So you've effectively got 2 armies, 2 Panzer armies, and Rommel's going to launch the attack at Kasserine. So it's really a follow-up attack to Sidi Bouzid. And if you have go close into the map, you can see Kasserine. You can see those 2 axes of advance meeting at Kasserine, and then ultimately driving to the northwest of Kasserine, and that's the pass. And the Battle of Kasserine Pass is very interesting, because the pass itself is defended by only 2,000 American servicemen. They're holding a position 3 miles long at the entrance to the pass. Not a very good location to choose to defend the pass. Really, you need to be on the high ground on either side. But in any case, they had 1 or 2 people up on the high ground. But the Germans are very good at infiltrating into the pass. They do take, I should mention, 36 hours to get through the pass. A lot of people think, Kasserine Pass is an utter disaster and the American servicemen don't fight that well. That's not true at all. They're heavily outnumbered. And after 36 hours of really pretty brutal fighting, they're outflanked. And it's what happens next. I think people remember the Kasserine Pass as a bit of a disaster, because yes, it's a defeat, but everyone breaks and they run. And that's never a good look on a battlefield. Rommel captures the pass, and he also captures about 20 American tanks and some armored vehicles, and said, oh my God, look at the equipment they've got. It's really interesting, because it's a moment of victory for him, but he looks at what the Americans have got, and he sort of knows from this point, this is just a small bit we've captured. And if they've got a lot more of this, we're in big, big trouble. And that's exactly what happens, because very shortly after the victory at Kasserine, he retreats back through the pass. And although it's a humiliation for American arms, and, and it doesn't, you read out the quote, of course, which was felt, everyone involved with the American fighting is ashamed of what's happened, but they recover very quickly. It's really interesting. The 1st Armored Division, or at least the Combat Command, recovers very quickly, and they stop Rommel getting any further, which he attempts to do a day later. So it's a disaster, but the speed with which American servicemen are learning to fight the British, learning to fight the Germans, is really very marked. And I think that's one of the important things about the North African campaign. I mentioned at the beginning why they go to North Africa. Yes, there were lots of strategic reasons, but also you've got to learn the business of fighting the Germans, and they're learning very quickly.
Well, I want to add on to that. It's interesting to me that it seems like all of the players take different lessons or make different observations from that battle. So, the Americans are humiliated, and they're determined to kind of right that wrong. The British say, well, the Americans, they really just haven't gotten that together yet. And that colors their impression of Americans' ability for a while. And Rommel takes a very different lesson from this. Like, oh my God, yeah, we got them, but they came back really quickly.
Yeah,
so
and I
could talk about.
It's fascinating that Rommel sees the writing on the wall from this point. I mean, you can look back at Rommel's whole career in North Africa, and it's an extraordinary sequence of victories that he is able to win over the British and the Commonwealth forces earlier on, and that's not really why we're discussing it. But when he gets to Tunisia, he relatively early on gets a sense of, we're really up against it here. And what's so ironic is that if all the forces that Hitler pours into North Africa, we talked about numbers. I said there were roughly about 15,000 Axis in the initial stages. But by the beginning of 1943, 200,000 troops have been put into North Africa. And that doesn't include the 150,000 or so in Rommel's force that are coming back from Egypt. So they are really doubling down. Hitler's really doubling down. And the irony is, if he'd done that in 1941, they probably almost certainly would have got all the way to the Suez Canal, would have interdicted all those supply routes to the rest of, the British Empire, possibly would have taken the oil fields of the Middle East. I mean, there were real benefits to gain. But when he puts all these troops in 1942, at a time America's now in the contest, it's a little, I mean, we know with hindsight, but it's a little bit too late. He should have done it a little earlier.
Yeah.
So many things that we can talk about here. But one of the other firsts here, so I said that it's a first for the Americans to be fighting the Germans. It's also the first time, I think, that Americans and British are fighting together. And they are pretty mixed up, right? Because you have American units under British command and you have these soldiers fighting in pretty close proximity. So is there any sort of culture clash, either at the top or at the bottom? What's going on there?
Yeah, there is. There's a lot of sorting out of, we do things differently. I think that, in broad brushstrokes, the British were very much of the mindset, and Chris hinted at this or kind of referred to this. British are very much of the mindset, we've been fighting the Germans for 2 years. We know what we're doing. But that argument only goes so far, because yes, the 8th Army probably knew what they were doing by this point, but we're not talking about the 8th Army until they arrive in Tunisia at the start of 1943. The army that we're referring to, and the army that was attacked at Kasserine, is the 1st Army with this US 2nd Corps attached. And that is an inexperienced army. So the British can talk all they like about the fact that they've been in the war for a couple of years, or 2.5 years at this stage. The reality is most of the troops that are fighting in North Africa, who are British and Commonwealth, actually have very little experience, and in some cases none at all. So they're not that different from the inexperienced American troops. Now, Eisenhower, of course, who's commander-in-chief of the whole operation, is absolutely determined that there is going to be no sense of backbiting on either side. And there was a lot of that, so he had to stamp it out. There's one famous occasion where he sacks an American staff officer for calling a British staff officer a...
You can say it.
I can say a limey bastard. Okay. And the Eisenhower's point was, you can call him a bastard as much as you like. You may even be right, but you can't use the national term. You can't distinguish him as not American. So that he has to go, and he was very good at making sure all the senior people in his staff were some Brits and some Americans, and the odd New Zealander and Australian possibly were thrown in there, but
basically Canadians.
Canadians, yeah, but not that many, but yes, 1 or 2. But I think that it did take a while for both sides, and Kasserine didn't help, of course, because again, as Chris hinted at, I think there's very much a sense of, as a result of Kasserine, yeah, you guys really don't know what you're doing. This is evidence of it. What they do, I think, which makes a big difference, is they bring in Alexander, one of the great British commanders of the Second World War, who had been commander-in-chief of Middle East, and he's brought in as army group commander. So his job basically is to but coordinate 1st Army with 8th Army. Okay, so the broader operational thing made complete sense, but he was also absolutely determined. And here he is. There you've got Ike, of course, on the right of the picture, and that's Alexander, or Alex as he was known at the time, on the left. Brilliant at handling people. He was a kind of wonderful kind of people person. Was he an absolutely genius field commander? No, probably not. He left the job to people like Monty Patton, who's going to come into the story. I can mention him in a second. Bradley, of course. And by the way, all these names, kind of tripping off the tongue. These are the guys who are going to go on and fight the rest of the war for the Western Allies. So all of them cut their teeth in French North Africa. But Alex, I think, plays a really key role, because not only does he drag everything together, he relieves Ike of the responsibility of commanding armies in the field, which is not what he's good at. Effectively, they move him upstairs, so he has to deal with politics and grander strategy. But the business of fighting in the armies and making sure everyone's happy and making certain that there's not bad feeling between the nationalities was Alexander's job. And I think you could say that by the end of the campaign, just to kind of reiterate the point, the two armies, the two different armed forces, have learnt the business of fighting together, and there's a certain amount of grudging but mutual respect between both of them.
So I want to bring in a question that one of our viewers asked, and it's about specifically some of those early tank actions, but I want to also expand on it. So Wally Morrison says, please describe the mentality of tank crews who went up against a superior machine.
Yeah,
I would kind of develop that a bit and say, during all of your research, what impression did you find any accounts of what the Americans are thinking when we're in the fight now? We're actually fighting the Germans. Or is it shock? Is it, what is their reaction to being in combat for the first time?
I think some of the initial armored actions. I mean, I gave you an example of one that was successful for the Americans, but it's a bigger picture than the one I gave. The bigger picture is actually they lose a lot of armor in the early stages, and there is a sense. And I mentioned Patton. Patton doesn't take part in the campaign until after Kasserine. He's training troops in Morocco with the deliberate intention of actually being part of operations later on. So they haven't sidelined him per se. Here's Patton, of course, on the left of the picture there with Ike. Patton's brought in December. That's after some of these early tank actions, to write a report about how the early fighting's gone. And of course, he is an armored expert. He's fought in the First World War in tanks. He's met Eisenhower actually not long after that, who also was a bit of a tank expert. I don't know if listeners and viewers are going to be surprised to hear that, but he was. And Patton is very much of the opinion we can't match them. They've just got better kit than us. We need to revise our tactics, which was good advice. But I think the idea, and you see this with a lot of the British accounts written by British servicemen at the time, is that we're outgunned by the Germans. Well, yes, up to a point. But the real advantage the Western Allies had, and I've already hinted at it with Rommel's comments, is qualitatively, particularly when you bring in the Tiger tank, and they had some Tiger tanks in French North Africa, maybe about 20, 25 Tiger tanks. That's nothing. I mean, when you talk about the kind of hundreds of Shermans that the Americans are going to bring into the fray, and the Churchills and the Grants and the other tanks that we had, I mean, we ultimately, by the end of this campaign, we're going to have absolute superiority in terms of numbers. Qualitatively, it's true that in some of these battles there was a feeling, and they go horribly wrong. And of course, the consequence for a tank crew, and I've got a lot of graphic descriptions, as you have to have, if you're going to be honest about what it's like, of the consequences of being up against superior armor is horrific. The whole of the tank can get burnt out, and burnt flesh, and the sight on the battlefield after an armored action. And there's one particular moment, I think, where some of the guys at the First Armored Division are looking back at a battlefield that's been fought a few months before, and Harmon, who goes on to become, one of the great tank commanders of the Second World War, but he's just taken over First Armored Division after its commander's been sacked, and he infuriates everyone by saying, guys, you didn't fight well last time. There's the evidence in front of you. And he's literally pointing at burnt out tanks with bodies still inside them. It was a really bad thing to say, but that's the reality for tank crews. It was a brutal way to fight. And if you're outgunned up against some of it wasn't just the armor. I hope I made that point clearly enough. The Germans are very good at anti-tank.
Well, and I guess that's something I wanted to get at. I mean, what was kind of the Allied, or specifically the American reaction to the shock of battle, right? This is their first big action, right? Did you come across any sense of like what the ordinary GI was thinking? Was it shock? Is it what?
Yeah, it's all of that. I mean, first of all, they're inexperienced, so any type of combat is going to be a shock. But I think that they built up. It reminds me a little bit when I was working on my Guadalcanal book about the Pacific War. Before the American servicemen get to Guadalcanal, which is their first proper offensive action of the Second World War, they very much have a sense that the Japanese are supermen, and the same thing is going on in North Africa. They've heard a lot about the Germans. They are aware that the Germans are in control of most of the continent. They've defeated the British and the French, and they've had pretty much an unbroken run of success. There is a certain amount of trepidation, and the shock of these initial battles, particularly when they lose a lot of armor, not always because the Germans are fighting well, sometimes because a lot of very bad decisions are taken, because a lot of people are inexperienced, and that happens in war. I think there is a real shock to the system. If you look at the way everyone's talking, that's from Patton saying we're being outgunned to, we're fighting very poorly, to General Anderson, who's in command of the First Army, who writes back to his boss back in the UK, the Chief of Imperial General Staff, Alan Brooke, and says, you know, I'm sorry I haven't achieved what I meant to achieve, but I've got a lot of inexperienced troops. He's basically throwing the Americans under the bus, actually, which refers back to a previous question that you asked. And he said, you know, the Americans are green and they won't listen to advice, as he puts it. I mean, it's completely undeserved criticism. In my view, his own troops were inexperienced, and he was a very poor commander himself. But you know, one of the worst things that happens in war or in life is that people don't take responsibility for their own inadequacy. They try and blame it on someone else. And that, as soon as I read that letter, by the way, is not an official letter. That was a private letter to Alan Brooke. I knew that Anderson was, you know, never be the great commander that he wanted to be, because he had certain, you know, character flaws that he couldn't cover up.
Yeah.
So we're approaching the end of our hour, and there's a lot more questions we could ask you about. But the Americans and the British do end up, of course, driving the Germans out of North Africa and capturing a huge number of them. What's, you know, you talked at the beginning about kind of what the state of the war was in November of 1942. When the fighting in Tunisia is over in May of 1943, how are things different?
Well, I think everything's changed by that point. So, you know, the quote from Voilemont, which was, as I said, with a certain amount of benefit of hindsight, was, you know, November's the kind of key moment. But in reality, it's what happens next. Yes, it's the start of change, but it's what happens next. So by the end of January 1943, beginning of February 1943, the surrender at Stalingrad. So you've got the total defeat at Stalingrad. You've also got Guadalcanal playing out in February 1943. But thirdly, you've got this third great moment, as I describe it in the book, the third great turning point of the Second World War, which is Tunisia. And it's rarely been recognized in that way. But the reason it's such a big game changer for the Germans is it leads directly to the Axis collapsing, that is Italy coming out of the war. That happens a few months later when Mussolini falls, and then, of course, his successor government doing an armistice with the Western allies. It's going to open up, as I've suggested, which was what Churchill hoped would happen, the whole of Southern Europe to attack. I mean, once the Western allies get into Italy, which they will do towards the end of the year, they're now able to strategically bomb the whole of southern Germany, where they put a lot of their arms factories, and the Ploesti oil fields in Romania, which is where they're going to get most of their oil. They were trying to get their oil, of course, as we know, in the Caucasus campaign, which is where they come unstuck at Stalingrad. So there were real key moments. And the other great important point to remember is the saving of all the shipping. All of the campaigns in the Second World War are joined up, and there's only a certain amount of shipping to go around. So we need landing craft in the Pacific, we need landing craft in the Mediterranean, we need it in Northwest Europe for D-Day. There's only a certain amount to go around, and what they save by capturing French North Africa, or the whole of North Africa, is 1 million tons of shipping, which no longer has to go all the way around the Cape of Africa. And they also destroy, last point, 2,400 planes in the Mediterranean, which is going to seriously dent, as 40% of the total of Axis fighter planes, and that's seriously going to dent their ability to fight on the Eastern Front and, of course, the Western Front, as it's going to become when we get into D-Day. So it is an utter catastrophe for the Axis forces that is recognized, I think, not only by the German public in the term Tunisgrad, but by Goebbels himself, of course, the propaganda chief, who says this is a campaign. He says this in his writes this in the diary. Tunis is a disaster that you can compare to Stalingrad. And also the wonderful speech that Churchill gives to the Joint Houses of Congress on the 19th of May. That's just a few days after the surrender, in which he makes the same point. Actually, that picture is a wonderful picture, isn't it? That's the victory speech he gives in Tunis itself. He flies from the US back to North Africa and gives a speech to everyone in the amphitheater. Wonderful location. If anyone watching this wants to go and see some of the sites in Tunisia, it's a great location. Obviously, I went there to do research for the book. But anyway, he tells the Joint Houses of Congress, the consequences of this action. We are masters of the North African shore, and everything changes from this point. And if you look at his 6-volume history of the Second World War, Volume 4, which basically ends with the capture of Tunis, is known as the Hinge of Fate. And the final thing, I think it's the final quote I've got in the book, is the hinge has turned. And that is absolute conviction that this campaign really mattered.
Well, Saul David, thank you.
Thank you, Saul.
Thank you so much for joining us. Saul David is the author, in this case, of Tunisgrad, Victory in Africa, among many books he's written. You know, Saul, we never asked you what your cocktail was. I know you got one.
Oh, sorry, guys. I'm actually on a beer. I mean,
fantastic. I have just finished mine. I drank my tea and then my beer, and so I'm in good shape. Chris, I assume you emptied your scotch glass.
No, I have just a little bit left for the last residual thoughts.
Okay.
So you just have 2 more shows to go, and you got a hat, so just keep writing faster.
So got to write more books.
I'm looking forward to it, guys.
Or thanks. Come on a panel. No, so thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Cheers. Okay, so Chris, next week we're in the same. Are you still in Windsor
I'm
next
still
week?
in Windsor, yes.
December.
I leave again on the 10th,
so tomorrow's December 1st, so our show must be December 6th, something like that. So you'll still be here. So we'll be talking to Doug Most, who is the author of a new book on Liberty ships, Launching Liberty, which I actually started to read today. So
vicious young man you are.
I know. I'm just advertising what a great, conscientious host I am in so many ways.
You're just angling to be the 4th guest on Saul's podcast. I think.
Oh yeah, we could. Saul could invite us. Hint, hint. To be on, I don't know. They might. Saul and Patrick Bishop. They might show us up, right? I mean, they might. If they invited us on, we might suddenly stand starkly revealed as potentially problematic. So anyway, next week we'll be talking about Liberty ships. Meantime, guys, please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon, and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.